Circa 12th century BCE, the shores of the Sea of Reeds. The sensory assault begins not with a sound, but with a smell. The rank, saline stench of low tide, of mud and rotting reeds mixed with the metallic odor of pure, unadulterated fear sweating from 600,000 bodies. A cold wind whips off the water, carrying the taste of salt and doom, a wind that does nothing to cut through the oppressive humidity of the Egyptian delta. To the front, an impossible, impassable expanse of dark, churning water, a liquid wall against the world. To the back, a rising cloud of dust on the horizon, a ochre plume that resolves itself into the terrifying glint of bronze spearheads, and the sun flashing off the polished sides of 600 elite chariots. The sound builds from a distant rumble into the thunder of thousands of hooves and the shrieking of war axles, a symphony of annihilation composed by the greatest military machine of the late Bronze Age. This is the army of Pharaoh, a steel avalanche pouring down the Wadi Tumilat, and for the fugitive slave nation huddled at the water's edge, it is the sound of the world ending. The chaos is absolute. The wailing of children, the lowing of terrified livestock, the frantic, high-pitched recriminations of a people who see their liberator, has led them not to freedom, but to an abattoir. They are a disorganized, terrified mob, trapped between the unyielding sea and the unmerciful sword. And in the center of this maelstrom of panic stands one man, Moses, his face weathered by 40 years of desert sun, his grip tight on a simple shepherd's staff. He feels the vibrations of the approaching army through the soles of his sandals, a tremor that signifies the end of his impossible gamble. The very air seems to crackle with the energy of their terror and his own doubt, a palpable pressure that threatens to crush him. He has brought them to this, to the very edge of existence, and there is no way forward and no way back. This is the crucible moment, the hinge upon which a story of epical scale will turn. This is the narrative of him, the man who stood between the hammer and the anvil, between a vengeful God and a faithless people, between the memory of a prince's life and the reality of a shepherd's exile. This was the saga of Moses, the prophet who saw the promised land, but was forbidden to enter it. The leader who wrestled not only with Pharaoh, but with his own profound reluctance. To understand this man, to grasp how an exile, a stammerer, a fugitive from his own past, became the leader of a people he explicitly feared to lead, we must ask the core question that his entire life poses. What force, what fire can forge a leader from a man who wants nothing more than to run? How does one who feels utterly inadequate become the conduit for absolute power? The paradox is baked into his very being. He is a Hebrew raised as an Egyptian, a man of two worlds belonging to neither, whose first act of leadership was a panicked flight into the wilderness. His story is not one of confident ambition, but of a destiny that hunted him down, that cornered him in the desert, and demanded of him a task so monumental it would shatter empires and redefine humanity's relationship with the divine. The answer lies not in a simple thirst for power, but in a complex and often terrifying dialogue between human frailty and a will that would not be denied. His journey begins not with a crown or a sword, but with the gnawing terror of inadequacy, a terror that would become the unlikely foundation of his unparalleled authority. Before he could lead a people out of bondage, he had to be dragged out of the prison of his own self-doubt, a prison whose walls were far thicker and more formidable than any garrisoned city in Egypt. It is this internal war that defines him more than any external battle, a war that raged from the bulrushes of the Nile to the lonely peak of Mount Nebo. To understand this man, we must first return to the world that spawned him, a world dominated by a single, monolithic power: Egypt. In the latter half of the second millennium BCE, the new kingdom of Egypt was not merely a nation, it was the center of the known world, a civilization of breathtaking antiquity and power that had endured for nearly 2,000 years. This was the Egypt of the great warrior pharaohs, of Thutmose III and Rameses II, whose armies had marched as far as the Euphrates and deep into Nubia. The very air in the Nile Valley seemed heavy with the weight of its own history, a place where the gods walked among men and the pharaoh was not a king, but Horus incarnate, a living deity whose word was cosmic law. Its capital cities, Thebes and Memphis, were sprawling metropolises of gilded temples, colossal statues, and labyrinthine bureaucracies, all fueled by the relentless, life-giving rhythm of the Nile's inundation. The sheer scale of its monumental architecture was a statement of eternal dominance, designed to awe and intimidate all who saw it. Far to the north, across the Great Green Sea, the Mycenaean palaces were flourishing, but they were fledgling kingdoms in comparison. To the east, in Mesopotamia, the Kassites ruled Babylon, but the old fire of Hammurabi was long extinguished. The only true rival to Egyptian power was the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, a worthy and dangerous foe with whom Egypt had clashed at the cataclysmic Battle of Kadesh. These two superpowers were the poles of the geopolitical chessboard, their influence extending over the vassal city-states of the Levant, the very land that would one day be called Canaan. Within this Egyptian imperium, the Hebrews were a people without a place, a tribe of Semitic pastoralists who, according to their own traditions, had fallen into servitude, becoming the engine of Pharaoh's vast building projects. Their sweat and blood mixed into the very mud bricks of garrison cities like Pithom and Ramses. They were a people on the underside of history, a marginal note in the grand imperial narrative of Egypt, their suffering unseen and their God unheard. Into this world of absolute power and absolute powerlessness, a child was born. The story begins not in a palace, but in a papyrus basket waterproofed with bitumen and pitch, a tiny ark set adrift on the current of the Great Nile. This is the origin of the man, steeped in the foundational paradox that will define his life. He is at once the most vulnerable of creatures, an infant abandoned to the river, and the most fortunate rescued by the daughter of the very tyrant who ordered the death of his people's sons. He is Hebrew by blood, born of the tribe of Levi, yet he is raised in the heart of the Egyptian court, given a name, Moses, which echoes the Egyptian word for is born, as in the names of pharaohs like Thutmose or Amos. He is a child of two worlds, a living contradiction. He learns the sophisticated theology of the Egyptian pantheon, the worship of Ra, Osiris, and Isis, even as the lullabies of his true mother, hired as his wet nurse, whisper in his ear the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the promises of a single unseen God. He is dressed in the fine linen of a prince, educated in the scribal schools, taught the arts of war and statecraft, yet his own features, the cast of his face, mark him as an outsider, one of the Habaru his adopted family holds in bondage. This duality creates an impossible internal conflict, a schism in the soul. He lives in a gilded cage, privy to the opulence and power of the empire, while knowing his true kin toil under the lash in the clay pits. This is his ancestral curse, not merely the fact of slavery, but his intimate daily proximity to it, a constant, searing reminder of his divided identity. His character is forged in this crucible of privilege and guilt, of belonging and alienation, creating a man who understands the language of power, but feels the sting of oppression in his very blood. The first step into the great game is not a calculated political maneuver, but an explosion of repressed identity, a single impulsive act of violence that irrevocably shatters his world. The narrative describes a moment of stark clarity. Moses, now a man grown, goes out to his people and sees their burdens. He witnesses an Egyptian taskmaster brutally beating a Hebrew slave. In that instant, the 40 years of palace life, of Egyptian education and privilege, evaporate in a flash of white-hot rage. The carefully constructed facade of the Egyptian prince cracks, and the Hebrew blood boils over. The chronicler tells us he looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck the Egyptian down and buried him in the sand. This is not the act of a revolutionary leader. It is the desperate, clumsy act of a man lashing out, a man whose internal conflict has finally become external. It is a moment of pure, unthinking, tribal loyalty. But the world does not allow such acts to remain hidden. The very next day, he tries to intervene in a dispute between two Hebrews, attempting to assert a kind of authority, and is met with a terrifying question. Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? The secret is out. His own people, the very ones he sought to defend, have exposed him. This is a profound psychological blow. He learns in that moment that his act of solidarity has not made him a hero. It has made him a liability. Worse, Pharaoh learns of the murder, and Moses, the adopted grandson of the divine king, is now a fugitive with a death sentence on his head. He does not stand and fight. He does not try to organize a rebellion. He runs. He flees eastward, deep into the Sinai wilderness, shedding his Egyptian identity like a snake sheds its skin, leaving behind the life of a prince to become a nameless exile. This panicked flight is the true beginning of his story, for it is in losing everything that the foundation for his future is laid. The 40 years in the land of Midian represent a great silence in the narrative, a long, fallow period where the prince becomes a shepherd, and the future prophet is seemingly forgotten by history. This is his crucible of isolation, a time of profound and transformative emptiness. He flees Egypt, a man stripped of his name, his status, and his purpose, and arrives at a well in the desert, the classic biblical setting for a fateful encounter. Here, he defends the daughters of Jethro, the priest of Midian, from rival shepherds, another act of impulsive justice, but this time tempered and controlled. He is welcomed into Jethro's tribe, marries his daughter Zipporah, and has a son, Gershom, a name heavy with meaning. I have been a sojourner in a foreign land. He has traded the gilded corridors of the Egyptian court for the vast, empty landscapes of the Sinai, the intrigues of power for the simple, repetitive rhythm of leading flocks to pasture. For 4 decades, he lives this life, a man actively burying his past. He is no longer the Egyptian prince, nor is he truly one of the Midianites. He is a man in self-imposed exile, not just from a place, but from his own destiny. Yet this period is not one of peace, but of simmering, unspoken conflict. The inner demon that haunts him is the memory of the suffering he left behind. Every sunset over the red mountains of the Sinai must have reminded him of the blood-colored Nile. Every cry of a lamb must have echoed the cries of the slaves in the clay pits. He is a man running from a divine call he does not yet understand, haunted by a question of identity he has failed to resolve. He is afraid. He is afraid of the power of Egypt, afraid of the rejection of his own people, and perhaps most of all, afraid of the man he was supposed to be. This long, quiet apprenticeship in the wilderness is essential. It strips him of his Egyptian arrogance, teaches him patience, and instills in him a deep knowledge of the harsh landscape that will one day be the stage for his people's redemption. The fateful encounter, when it comes, arrives not with the fanfare of trumpets, but in the profound silence of the desert, at the foot of Horeb, the mountain of God. It is a moment that shatters the mundane reality of his shepherd's life. He leads his flock to the far side of the wilderness and sees it, a thorn bush, a flame, yet unconsumed. The physics of the world are suspended. The sensory details are stark. The dry desert air, the heat of the sun, and this impossible, steady fire that burns without fuel and radiates not just heat, but a palpable sense of presence. Curiosity draws him closer, and it is then that the silence is broken by a voice that calls his name, Moses, Moses. It is a voice that knows him, that anchors him in his own identity after 40 years of anonymity. The command is immediate and terrifying. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. In this single command, the entire cosmic order is reoriented. The ground is not holy because of a temple or an altar, but because of the presence of the I Am, the unseen God of his fathers. The commission that follows is staggering. He, the fugitive, the shepherd, the man who has spent half his life in hiding, is to be the instrument of liberation. He is to go back to the place of his greatest trauma, to stand before the incarnation of divine power on earth, Pharaoh himself, and demand the release of the Hebrew slaves. Moses' reaction is not faith, but pure, rational terror. He argues. He makes excuses. His response is a litany of profound self-doubt. "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh?" he asks, a question that cuts to the core of his 40-year identity crisis. He then questions the very name of God, seeking a concrete identity for this abstract presence. When told he will be believed, he protests, "What if they do not believe me or listen to me?" Finally, in a moment of raw, desperate vulnerability, he reveals his deepest insecurity. "O Lord, I have never been eloquent. I am slow of speech and tongue." He is a man looking for any possible exit from this terrifying destiny. But every excuse is countered. Every fear is met not with reassurance, but with a sign of power. The staff that becomes a serpent, the hand that becomes leprous and then clean. He is a man cornered by the divine, his reluctance systematically dismantled until nothing is left but the horrifying, unavoidable mission. The return to Egypt is the first true test. The moment the shepherd must become the statesman, the hesitant messenger must become the divine ambassador. This is the beginning of the price of power. He does not arrive at the head of an army, but as an 80-year-old man accompanied by his brother Aaron, armed with nothing more than a shepherd's staff and a terrifying message. The confrontation with Pharaoh is a clash not just of men, but of cosmologies. Moses and Aaron enter the grand hypostyle halls of the Egyptian court, places of overwhelming power and grandeur, surrounded by courtiers, priests, and soldiers who view them as nothing more than desert wanderers, representatives of a slave rabble. Their demand is audacious, an insult to the entire Egyptian world order. "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go." Pharaoh's response is one of predictable and utter contempt, a sneer from a man who considers himself a god on earth. "Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and moreover, I will not let Israel go." To Pharaoh, this is not a negotiation, it is a blasphemy. He responds not by listening, but by increasing the cruelty of the bondage, demanding the slaves make the same quota of bricks, but now without being supplied the straw. He turns the screw, a classic tactic of the tyrant, designed to make the people turn on their would-be liberators. And it works. The Hebrew foremen, beaten and desperate, confront Moses and Aaron, crying out, "You have made us stink in the sight of Pharaoh." This is the first taste of the true burden of leadership. It is not just about confronting the enemy without, but about withstanding the despair and anger of the people within. Moses' first foray into the great game ends in what appears to be a catastrophic failure, increasing the suffering of his people and earning their scorn. It is a brutal lesson in the cost of challenging an empire, a cost paid first not by the leader, but by those he seeks to save. The great antagonist of this saga is not just a man, but the system he represents. Pharaoh is the living embodiment of the Egyptian empire, a civilization built on a rigid cosmic hierarchy where he sits at the apex, the sole intermediary between the gods and humanity. His power is absolute, not merely political or military, but theological. The stability of the entire world, the rising of the Nile, the journey of the sun across the sky, is all seen as dependent on his maintenance of Ma'at, the divine order of truth, balance, and justice. From his perspective, the demand of an unknown desert god, the god of a slave people, is a direct assault on this cosmic order. It is an introduction of chaos into a perfectly balanced system. The conflict, therefore, plays out on a macro level as a duel between two rival theologies. On one side stands Pharaoh, surrounded by his powerful priests and magicians, masters of the ancient Egyptian arts of magic and ritual, representing a pantheon of gods with tangible forms, animal heads, and established cults. On the other side stands Moses, representing a god who is invisible, nameless, and transcendent, a god whose power is not tied to a temple or an idol. The initial confrontations are a contest of power. When Aaron throws down his staff and it becomes a serpent, Pharaoh's magicians, with their secret arts, are able to replicate the feat. The Egyptian system can, at first, absorb and match this new power. This is a critical moment. Pharaoh is not depicted as a fool, but as the head of a sophisticated and powerful religious political structure that has every reason to believe in its own superiority. His refusal to yield is not just stubbornness, it is a defense of his entire civilization, his gods, and his own divine identity against an existential threat. The repeated phrase, "The Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart," can be understood not just as a supernatural act, but as a psychological portrait of a tyrant. Each challenge to his absolute authority only makes him more intransigent, more determined to assert his power, a classic trait of the autocrat who cannot, under any circumstances, be seen to back down. This is a clash of two cosmic wills, and the land of Egypt itself will become the battlefield. The sequence of the 10 plagues is the psychological breaking point of the narrative, a descent into an escalating nightmare that transforms not only Egypt, but Moses himself. It begins with the water of the life-giving Nile turning to blood, an attack on the very circulatory system of the Egyptian state and its gods. This is not just a disaster, it is a theological statement. The subsequent plagues, frogs, gnats, flies, are a systematic dismantling of the Egyptian environment, turning the sources of life into sources of revulsion and chaos. Initially, Pharaoh's magicians can compete, but soon they are overwhelmed, forced to admit, this is the finger of God. The plagues then escalate to attack the foundations of the economy and society. The death of livestock, the outbreak of boils on human flesh, a terrifying hailstorm of fire and ice that devastates the crops. With each plague, Moses' role shifts. He is no longer the hesitant messenger. He becomes a grim, relentless prophet of doom, his warnings becoming more stark, his confrontations with Pharaoh more charged. He is forced to witness the suffering his words unleash, to see the devastation that liberation requires. This is a profound and terrible education. He learns the brutal calculus of revolution, that an entrenched system of oppression does not yield to persuasion, but only to the application of overwhelming, catastrophic force. He is being reforged in the crucible of this divine violence, shedding his shepherd's meekness and donning the terrifying mantle of a divine instrument. The plague of locusts, which consumes what little the hail left, and the subsequent plague of impenetrable darkness, a direct assault on Pharaoh's chief god, Ra, are the final stages of this deconstruction. The narrative shows a world being unmade, the divine order of Majat being systematically inverted into chaos, proving that Pharaoh is powerless to protect his own people, let alone maintain cosmic balance. For Moses, this is the fatal mistake he must internalize. The path to freedom lies through utter devastation. The 10th plague is the horrifying climax of this campaign of chaos, the moment that forever sears the identity of the Hebrew people. It is an act of such chilling precision and terror that it finally shatters the will of the Egyptian empire. The opportunity arises from the very darkness that has enveloped the land, a physical and metaphorical blindness that sets the stage for the final blow. The instructions are stark and ritualistic. Each Hebrew family is to take a perfect, unblemished lamb, slaughter it at twilight, and paint its blood on the doorposts and lintel of their home. This is a shocking act, as the lamb was sacred to several Egyptian deities. It is an act of defiance carried out under the cover of the supernatural darkness. They are then to roast the lamb and eat it in haste, with their loins girded, their sandals on their feet, and their staff in their hand, dressed not for a meal, but for an immediate journey. This is the first Passover, a ritual born of terror and anticipation. It forges a scattered collection of slave families into a single unified body through a shared, secret act of obedience. While they huddle inside their blood-marked houses, the destroyer passes through the land of Egypt, and a great cry arises, for there is not a house, from the palace of Pharaoh to the dungeon of the captive, where there is not one dead. The plague strikes at the heart of Egyptian society and religion, the firstborn, the heir, the future. It is the ultimate inversion of Pharaoh's own decree to kill the Hebrew firstborn sons. This night of collective trauma and miraculous protection is the true moment of national birth. It is not a declaration of independence written on a scroll, but a covenant written in blood on the wood of their homes. When Pharaoh, his own heir now dead, finally capitulates and screams at Moses and Aaron to get out, to take their people and their flocks and be gone, it is a broken man and a broken empire that releases its grip. The Hebrews do not leave as supplicants. They leave having plundered the Egyptians, who, in their grief and terror, give them whatever they ask, a final act of psychological dominance. The scene at the Sea of Reeds is the greatest triumph, the cinematic climax of the entire Exodus. It is the moment where faith, terror, and divine power converge to create an event that will echo through millennia. Having been thrust out of Egypt, the newly freed people are not yet a nation. They are a refugee column, a disorganized multitude burdened by children, livestock, and the psychological shackles of generations of slavery. Their moment of euphoria is short-lived, as Pharaoh, his grief quickly turning to rage and regret, mobilizes his elite chariot corps to pursue them. The strategic situation is a nightmare, a perfect trap. The desert is to their sides, the sea is before them, and the vengeful Egyptian army is closing behind them. This is the moment of ultimate despair, where the people turn on Moses, their fear curdling into bitter accusation. Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? All seems lost. This is where Moses, now fully transformed from the stammering shepherd of the burning bush, speaks with absolute, unwavering authority. "Do not be afraid," he commands the terrified crowd. "Stand firm and you will see the delivery the Lord will bring you today. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." It is a breathtaking display of leadership in the face of annihilation. What follows is a scene of pure, mythic power. A pillar of cloud and fire moves to stand between the Hebrews and the Egyptians, plunging the pursuers into darkness while illuminating the path for the pursued. Moses stretches his hand out over the sea, and a great east wind blows all night, piling the water into two liquid walls, exposing a path of dry land through the heart of the deep. The sensory experience must have been terrifying and awe-inspiring. The roaring of the wind, the sight of the towering walls of water shimmering in the divine light, the feel of the muddy, yet firm seabed underfoot as an entire nation walks into the abyss. And when the last of them has crossed, and the Egyptian army recklessly charges in after them, Moses again stretches out his hand, and the walls of water collapse, a liquid avalanche that annihilates the most powerful army on earth in a churning vortex of water, mud, and shattered chariots. The birth of the nation is complete, baptized in the waters of the sea. The aftermath of this cataclysmic victory is a moment of pure, unadulterated elation, the psychological peak of the entire journey. As the sun rises, the Israelites see the bodies of their former masters washed up on the seashore. The charioteers, the soldiers, the symbols of their oppression, now just lifeless refuse tossed by the waves. The fear that has defined their existence for 400 years is washed away with the tide. This is the moment of hubris, but not for Moses alone. It is a collective triumph that borders on ecstasy. Miriam, the prophetess, Aaron's sister, takes a timbrel in her hand, and all the women follow her, dancing and singing. Moses himself leads the people in a great hymn of victory, the Song of the Sea, a poetic masterpiece that captures the raw emotion of the moment. "I will sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. Both horse and driver he has hurled into the sea." This is not a humble prayer of thanks. It is a triumphant, almost boastful war song, celebrating the violent destruction of their enemy. It marks a profound psychological shift. For the first time, they see their God not just as the God of their fathers, a tribal deity, but as a warrior, a divine champion who has utterly humiliated the gods of the mighty Egyptian empire. And in this moment of collective victory, Moses' own transformation is cemented. He is no longer just a messenger. He is the undisputed leader, the proven conduit of a terrifying and invincible power. The people who had, only hours before, been screaming recriminations at him, now look at him with awe and fear. The scripture is explicit. "And when the Israelites saw the great power the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses, his servant." This is the apex of his authority, forged in the crucible of the sea. He has delivered on his impossible promise. he has led them out of bondage. But this very moment of absolute triumph contains the seeds of future conflict. For the people's trust is based on a display of overwhelming power, not on a deep, internal faith, a distinction that will soon come to haunt him in the desolate wilderness ahead. No sooner has the song of triumph faded from their lips than Moses is confronted with his true and most persistent enemy. It is not a foreign king or an imperial army, but the profound spiritual weakness and fear lurking within the hearts of his own people. This becomes brutally clear at the foot of Mount Sinai. While Moses is enveloped in thunder and lightning atop the holy mountain, receiving the foundations of the law, the people below quickly descend into a panic of spiritual abandonment. 40 days is too long to wait in silence. They are a people accustomed to tangible gods, to idols of wood and stone they can see and touch. The invisible, abstract God who speaks from the fire is too new, too frightening. Their fear metastasizes into rebellion. They gather around Aaron, the high priest, the brother of the prophet, and demand of him, "Come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." This is a stunning betrayal. They have already forgotten the miracles of the plagues and the parting of the sea. Their slave mentality, their need for a visible master, reasserts itself with frightening speed. Aaron, in a moment of catastrophic weakness, capitulates. He collects their golden earrings, the very plunder from their Egyptian oppressors, and casts a golden calf, a familiar symbol of divinity and power in the ancient Near East, echoing the Egyptian bull god Apis. The people declare, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." It is the ultimate blasphemy, a rejection of the very God who redeemed them. When Moses descends from the mountain, bearing the stone tablets inscribed by the finger of God, and sees the people engaged in frenzied, orgiastic revelry before the idol, his fury is tectonic. He smashes the tablets at the foot of the mountain, a symbolic act showing that the people have broken the covenant before it was even delivered. He understands in this moment that his sworn enemy is not the external oppressor, but the internal Egypt that the people still carry within them. Their fear, their impatience, their deep-seated craving for the familiar comforts of idolatry. This battle against the golden calf will be the defining struggle of the next 40 years. In the wake of the golden calf betrayal, Moses' task shifts from liberation to construction. The chaos of a slave mob must be forged into the order of a holy nation. This begins with the monumental task of giving the law. The 10 Commandments, the 2 tablets of stone that Moses brings down from the mountain a second time, are the ethical constitution of this new society, a radical moral framework for its time. They establish the absolute supremacy of one God and then pivot to regulate human relationships, honoring parents, prohibiting murder, adultery, theft, and false witness. This is the beginning of ethical monotheism, the idea that the one God is not just powerful, but also just and righteous, and demands a corresponding righteousness from his people. But the law given through Moses is far more extensive than just these 10 statements. It is a comprehensive legal, civil, and ritual code, the Torah, that governs every aspect of life, from diet and hygiene to property disputes and criminal justice. It is an attempt to create a complete and self-contained world, a society ordered not by the arbitrary whim of a divine Pharaoh, but by a written, knowable, and universal law. Alongside this legal framework, Moses receives detailed instructions for the construction of the tabernacle, a portable sanctuary that will be the physical center of Israel's worship in the wilderness. This is a brilliant piece of statecraft. The tabernacle with its intricate design, the Holy of Holies, the Ark of the Covenant, the golden lampstand, provides a tangible focus for the people's religious devotion, a controlled and ordered way for them to experience the divine presence, replacing the chaotic idolatry of the golden calf. It creates a formal priesthood centered on his brother Aaron, and a system of sacrifices and rituals that will structure the community's calendar and daily life. This is nation-building from the ground up, a breathtaking attempt to impose a sophisticated moral and spiritual architecture upon the raw, anarchic energy of a traumatized and rebellious people. While the grand narrative focuses on Moses' relationship with God and Pharaoh, his life is also shaped by a complex web of personal relationships, the onions and vegetables that add flavor and texture to the epic. His family is both his greatest support system and a source of internal conflict. His brother, Aaron, is his essential partner. While Moses is the visionary, the brooding, isolated conduit of God's word, Aaron is the public relations man, the eloquent speaker who can face the people and the court. Yet Aaron is also a source of weakness, as seen in his catastrophic capitulation to the mob during the golden calf incident. Miriam, his sister, is a prophetess in her own right, the one who leads the women in the victory song at the Red Sea. But she and Aaron also challenge Moses' unique authority, asking, "Has the Lord spoken only through Moses? Hasn't he also spoken through us?" This act of sibling rivalry results in a divine punishment for Miriam, a stark reminder of Moses' singular position. His personal life is also marked by his status as an outsider. His wife, Zipporah, is a Midianite, not a Hebrew. She is the one who, in a strange and ancient ritual, saves him from a divine attack on his journey back to Egypt by circumcising their son. This marriage to a foreigner is later a source of contention, yet it also highlights his unique liminal identity. The internal politics of the tribes, particularly his own tribe of Levi, are a constant undercurrent. The Levites are set apart as the priestly caste, loyal to Moses during the Golden Calf Rebellion. But this also creates tensions and power struggles, such as the rebellion of Korah, a fellow Levite who challenges the authority of Moses and Aaron, leading to a terrifying divine judgment. These familial and tribal dynamics ground the epic story in the messy realities of human jealousy, ambition, and loyalty. They show that even as he was communing with God on the mountain, Moses had to navigate the treacherous terrain of his own family and inner circle, adding another layer of complexity to the burden of his leadership. The 40 years of wandering in the desert are not a triumphant march to the Promised Land, but a long, slow, grinding purgatory. This period is defined by the first cracks in the national project, the constant harbingers of the storm that is the people's own faithlessness. The narrative becomes a repetitive, almost agonizing cycle of crisis, complaint, and divine intervention. The initial euphoria of the Red Sea crossing evaporates almost immediately in the harsh reality of the Sinai wilderness. The people complain about the bitter water at Marah. They complain about the lack of food, expressing a shocking nostalgia for the very bondage they escaped. If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death. This slave mentality, the preference for a full belly and servitude over the risks of freedom, is the spiritual cancer that Moses must constantly fight. God provides manna from heaven and quail, a miraculous sustenance, but the people's gratitude is fleeting. They rebel against Moses' leadership as seen in the insurrection of Korah. They complain about the monotony of the manna. At every new challenge, their first instinct is not to trust in the God who split the sea, but to grumble and look backward. The most devastating blow comes from the report of the 12 spies sent to scout out the land of Canaan. 10 of the spies return with a report of fear, describing giants and fortified cities, concluding, "We can't attack those people. They are stronger than we are." They spread despair through the camp, and the entire nation gives itself over to weeping and rebellion, even plotting to choose a new leader to take them back to Egypt. This is the ultimate act of faithlessness. They have come to the very border of their destiny and have recoiled in fear. It is this moment that seals the fate of that entire generation. The divine decree is handed down. Because of their rebellion, not one of them, save for the 2 faithful spies, Joshua and Caleb, will enter the promised land. They are condemned to wander the desert for 40 years, until the entire generation of slaves has died off, a slow, tragic erosion of a people's spirit, and a terrible burden for the leader who must guide them on this journey to nowhere. In the midst of this long, exhausting marathon of leadership, Moses himself, the patient lawgiver, finally breaks. The fateful act, the psychological error that seals his own destiny, occurs at the waters of Meribah. The scene is tragically familiar. The congregation is without water, and once again, they turn on Moses and Aaron with their customary venom and recrimination. Decades of this constant, grinding faithlessness have taken their toll. God gives Moses a clear instruction. Speak to that rock before their eyes, and it will pour out its water. The miracle is to be accomplished by a word, a demonstration of divine power through quiet faith. But Moses is at the end of his rope. His frustration, his rage at this perennially ungrateful people, boils over. He gathers the assembly before the rock, but instead of speaking to it, he addresses the people with bitter contempt. "Listen, you rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock?" The word "we" is a subtle but critical moment of hubris, a flicker of ego where Moses momentarily associates himself with the divine power. Then, instead of speaking the command, he acts out his fury. He strikes the rock twice with his staff. Water gushes out, and the people drink, but the act of disobedience has been committed in the sight of all. It is a profound psychological failure. For a fleeting moment, he allowed his own anger to overshadow his role as a divine instrument. He misrepresented God to the people, presenting him as a power that responds to angry force rather than faithful speech. He took the glory for himself. The divine judgment is immediate, swift, and heartbreaking. God says to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I have given them." It is a single moment of uncontrolled anger, born of years of provocation, but in his unique position, it is a catastrophic failure. The leader who had been the model of forbearance had, in a moment of human weakness, failed his own ultimate test. The divine decree following the incident at Meribah is the greatest personal catastrophe of Moses' life, a resolution to his personal journey that is both tragic and profoundly meaningful. The sentence, "You will not bring this community into the land I have given them," is a blow that redefines his entire mission. The man who sacrificed his identity, confronted the world's greatest power, and endured 40 years of his people's rebellion for the sake of a single goal, will now be denied the fruit of that labor. This is not a defeat in battle or a political overthrow. It is a moral and spiritual catastrophe, a failure at the very finish line. The irony is staggering. He will succeed for his people, bringing them to the banks of the Jordan, but he will fail for himself. From this point forward, the narrative is imbued with a deep pathos. Moses is now leading his people to a future he will not share, preparing them for a life he will not live. This divine judgment forces a profound psychological shift. His leadership is no longer about achieving a personal goal, but about pure, selfless service to the next generation. He must pour all his remaining energy into ensuring they are ready to succeed where he is forbidden to go. His greatness is magnified in this final act of obedience to his own tragic fate. He does not rail against God or abandon his post. He accepts his sentence and redoubles his efforts. He is a living lesson for the people, that the covenant, the law, and the nation are more important than any single individual, even their great liberator. His personal failure becomes his ultimate act of leadership, demonstrating that the mission transcends the man. The Promised Land was never a personal reward for him. It was a destiny for his people, and his role was to get them to the threshold, even if he himself could never cross it. This tragic turn elevates his story from a simple heroic epic to a complex meditation on the nature of sacrifice, obedience, and the lonely burden of command. The final phase of Moses' life is a long, poignant farewell tour, a last chance to consolidate his legacy and prepare his people for the future without him. This is the collapse of his personal dream, but it is also the final, critical stage of nation building. The narrative shifts to the plains of Moab, on the east bank of the Jordan River, directly across from the Promised Land. The 40 years are complete. The generation of slaves has passed away. A new, tougher generation, born and raised in the freedom and hardship of the wilderness, stands ready. Moses' final acts are a whirlwind of activity, a leader desperately trying to impart a lifetime of wisdom before his time runs out. He leads them in their final military campaigns, defeating the powerful Amorite kings, Sihon and Og, securing the territory east of the Jordan. These victories are crucial, giving the Israelites their first taste of settled land and providing a strategic staging ground for the coming invasion of Canaan. But his most important final acts are verbal. The entire book of Deuteronomy is structured as his farewell address, a series of powerful speeches delivered to the people on the eve of their entry into the land. He recounts their shared history, reminding them of their rebellions and God's faithfulness. He reiterates the law, expounding upon it, explaining its meaning, and urging them to hold fast to the covenant. This is his last chance to shape their national character, to instill in them a loyalty to the law that will survive without his physical presence. It is in these speeches that he utters some of his most famous words, including the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Finally, and most poignantly, he performs the passing of the mantle. In a public ceremony, he lays his hands on his chosen successor, Joshua, transferring his authority and spirit to him. It is a selfless and necessary act, ensuring a smooth transition of power and giving the people a new leader to follow across the river. He has done everything he possibly can. He has led the people out of slavery, given them the law, and brought them to the very edge of their destiny. Now his work is finished. The hero's finale is not a scene of battle or public spectacle, but one of profound, majestic solitude. It is a quiet, cinematic conclusion that brings his entire story full circle. After delivering his final blessings to the tribes of Israel, Moses walks away from the camp, leaving behind the people he has carried for 40 years, and begins his solitary ascent of Mount Nebo. The sensory details are stark and poignant. The feel of the rocky ground beneath his 120-year-old feet, the thin, high-altitude air, the vast desert landscape stretching out below him. From the summit, God grants him his final, bittersweet reward. He is given a panoramic vision of the Promised Land in its entirety. The rolling hills of Gilead, the lands of Naphtali and Ephraim, the Negev to the south, the Jordan Valley, and the distant gleam of the Western Sea. He sees the entire future of his people laid out before him. The land of milk and honey that was the object of his entire life's struggle. He sees it, but he cannot enter. The text describes this moment with a beautiful and heartbreaking simplicity. He sees it with his eyes, but he will not cross over. This is the ultimate fulfillment of his paradoxical destiny. The leader who sees the goal, but whose personal journey ends at the threshold. The narrative states that he died there in Moab by the word of the Lord, and that God himself buried him in a valley, a final, intimate act between the prophet and his deity. The circumstances are ironic and circular. His life began with him being drawn out of the water of the Nile, and it ends on a high, lonely mountain. He was a man who led a multitude of 600,000, yet he dies utterly alone. His finale is a powerful statement about the nature of his calling. It was never about personal glory or reward, but about fulfilling a divine purpose. A purpose that required his own self-effacement at the very end. The legacy of Moses is a conflict of interpretations, a testament to the immense and multifaceted shadow he casts over human history. His figure is so foundational that he is perceived and evaluated in profoundly different ways across nations, cultures, and religions, each one claiming a piece of his narrative. For Judaism, he is Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses our teacher, the greatest of all prophets, the lawgiver through whom God gave the Torah, the very constitution and lifeblood of the Jewish people. He is the archetypal liberator who led them from bondage to nationhood, and his story in the book of Exodus is retold every year at Passover, forming the core of Jewish identity. For Christianity, Moses is a crucial forerunner to Jesus Christ. He is the giver of the old law, which Christians believe is fulfilled and superseded by the new covenant of grace. The Apostle Paul frequently contrasts the law of Moses with faith in Christ, yet Jesus himself is often portrayed as a new Moses, delivering a new law, the Sermon on the Mount, leading a new exodus from the bondage of sin, and whose transfiguration occurs alongside Moses and Elijah. In Islam, he is known as Musa, one of an elite group of the most revered prophets of God, mentioned in the Quran more than any other individual. The story of his confrontation with Pharaoh, is a central Quranic narrative, a timeless parable of the struggle between divine truth and earthly tyranny. Beyond the Abrahamic faiths, Moses has become a universal symbol. For political liberation movements throughout history, from the American revolutionaries to the civil rights movement, the story of the Exodus has been a powerful metaphor for the struggle against oppression. For others, he is the archetypal lawgiver, the foundation of Western legal and ethical thought. This conflict of interpretations, prophet, lawgiver, liberator, forerunner, symbol, ensures that his story is never static. He remains a living, breathing presence in the world's imagination, a figure continually reinterpreted to speak to the deepest aspirations and struggles of humanity. We are now brought back to the central dramatic paradox, the core question that has driven this entire saga. How did an exile, a man crippled by fear and self-doubt, become the leader of a nation he was terrified to lead, only to be denied the final prize? The answer lies in the very nature of his weaknesses and his unique, fractured identity. He became the leader precisely because he was an outsider. As a Hebrew-raised Egyptian, he understood both the mentality of the slave and the mechanics of the empire. He could speak to Pharaoh in the language of the court, while feeling the pain of his people in his own blood. This dual perspective gave him a unique authority that no one raised entirely within one world could possess. He was forced into the role against his will, which paradoxically made him the perfect candidate. His reluctance, his constant arguments with God, his stammering speech, these were not signs of weakness, but proof that his ambition was not for personal power. He feared the role because, unlike a natural-born tyrant, he understood its impossible moral and spiritual weight. His leadership was not a conquest, but a burden he was compelled to carry. And why was he forbidden from entering the promised land? Because his ultimate purpose was not to be a king, but a teacher. His personal failure at the waters of Meribah served as the final, most powerful lesson for his people. It demonstrated that the law was absolute and that no one, not even the great Moses, was above it. His destiny was not to build a physical kingdom, but to build the invisible architecture of the nation's soul, its laws, its memory, its covenant with God. His journey was about the transformation of his people and himself, not about the acquisition of territory. His ultimate act of leadership was to make himself obsolete, to create a system of laws and a successor in Joshua that would allow the nation to continue without him. He did not reach the promised land because his promised land was the people themselves, forged and finalized, ready to begin their history. His failure was his final, greatest success. The verdict of history on the life of Moses is a profound and universal lesson on the nature of power, faith, and the agonizing process of forging a nation. His saga is the archetypal story of the clash between an established, seemingly eternal empire built on human power and a revolutionary idea of freedom built on divine will. It is a testament to the fact that history is often moved not by the confident and the powerful, but by the reluctant and the broken, by individuals called to a purpose far greater than themselves. The universal lesson of his life is about the excruciating price of leadership. It is not about glory, but about absorbing the sins, fears, and failures of a people onto oneself. Moses is a leader who argues with God, who despairs of his followers, who succumbs to anger, and who ultimately accepts a tragic personal fate for the sake of the collective good. His life demonstrates that true nation-building is not a political or military exercise alone. It is a spiritual and moral crucible. It is the slow, painful process of turning a traumatized, fearful mob into a people bound by a shared code of ethics and a sense of divine purpose. The 40 years in the desert were not a detour. They were the entire point. It was a necessary furnace to burn away the slave mentality and forge a new identity. His story represents the birth of an idea that would change the world, that law should be above any human ruler, that justice is a divine mandate, and that even the most powerless of people can challenge the greatest of empires if they are united by a transcendent cause. The struggle against fate is central to his narrative, but it is a fate he ultimately embraces, teaching that the journey of a people is always more important than the arrival of its leader. The final frame of this epic saga is not a grand monument or a triumphant statue. It is an image of profound and deliberate emptiness. The last words the scripture offers about the man himself are these: "He buried him in Moab, in the valley opposite Beth Peor. But to this day, no one knows where his grave is." This is the delicious kebab, the final philosophical aftertaste. The man who was the most public of figures, who spoke to God face to face, who commanded a nation of hundreds of thousands, is given an anonymous grave. The leader who brought forth the most influential legal and moral code in human history leaves behind no physical trace, no shrine for pilgrimage, no bones to be venerated as relics. This is the ultimate statement of his purpose. His legacy was not to be found in a cult of personality or a monument of stone, but in the living words of the Torah and in the enduring identity of the people he forged. By having no known grave, he cannot be deified. He remains forever a teacher, a lawgiver, a prophet, a human conduit for a divine message, but never the message itself. The final image is that of the wind sweeping over the plains of Moab, over a valley that holds an unknowable secret. The shadow he casts is not that of a king on a throne, but that of a lonely figure on a mountaintop, pointing the way to a future he would never reach. His story dissolving back into the narrative of the people, becoming a memory, a lesson, and a law that travels not to a single sacred place on earth, but to every corner of the world where his story is told.